I were a correctional officer at a supermax prison near Florence, Colorado. I stayed there as an employee for half a decade. During my time there, I witnessed almost everything imaginable: escape attempts, stabbings, riots, and sharp weapons hidden in places you wouldn't want to visualize. These are just a few of the more unpleasant occurrences I dealt with in the past. I am currently writing this using encrypted Wi-Fi from an undisclosed but safe location. I have since changed careers following the events of the story I'm about to share with you. I hope that anyone considering becoming a prison guard reads my story and reconsiders their future life choices to avoid looking back with regret. The warden called me into his office on a Monday. During the entire walk down the hallways, I thought about the trouble I might be in. "Let me shut the door," he said, as he looked up at me from his desk after I had entered. Those words etched into my mind, making me realize I was in hot water for some infraction I was not yet aware of. The bureaucratic micromanaging and constant procedural changes were nothing new to me, but I still hated petty political grievances. I nodded and closed the door, then took a seat as he demanded. "You're the best officer here," he said. I waited for the but. I anticipated news of my termination or a forced transfer to some mundane position involving filing paperwork. "I want to give you an opportunity," he continued. "You'll make $600,000 in 1 year. Your benefits will remain unchanged, and you will have less oversight than you currently do. You would be in a leadership position, albeit an isolated one." That sounded ideal. I considered the possibilities of the profit he had offered. "There are only 2 things we ask of you. First, you cannot tell anyone about your new position, and second, you must relocate. There's a prison in the Arctic, and that will be your life for the next 365 days. Confusion must have been readable on my face. "If your wife asks, tell her that you're going to a federal academy. There is no cell service or Wi-Fi there, and any contact with her must be through mail. We will handle the addresses given. If you decline this offer, then this conversation never happened. Do you understand?" I contemplated the pros and cons. Before becoming a law enforcement officer, I was a bodyguard, so I was used to being away from home for extended periods. Even though it would mean lost time with my wife, the fortune would benefit both of us. I agreed. The prison facility was a large compound, not much bigger than the one I patrolled before. A few things stood out to me when I first laid eyes on the inmates. They all had wounds on their faces and spoke a strange, guttural language I was unfamiliar with. Why did they talk in such a bizarre manner? I wondered as I walked down the blocks. The new warden I worked under, named Buckley, had noticeable scar tissue beneath his eyes. His attitude towards me at the beginning was hardly welcoming. If anything, he seemed to see me as a burden, resenting the possibility of having to train me. One evening, Buckley ordered me to do a cell extraction. Christopher Aluko was the name of the inmate we had to deal with. On the walk there, I asked my boss what Aluko had done to end up here. "I'm not allowed to tell you what these scumbags have done to wind up here," Buckley sighed. "But he started his criminal career by cannibalizing his sister. Tonight, our only goal is to move him to solitary confinement. He's proven too dangerous to share a space with anyone." The cell doors were more like those in an insane asylum than a prison. They were complete barriers you couldn't see through. It was me and 3 other guards about to deal with this high-profile detainee, while the supervisor stayed on standby, not getting his hands dirty. Upon entering, the first thing I saw was Aluko sitting upright on his cot. He was huge, at least 6'8" and 320 pounds of pure muscle. His skin was cracked all over, and his face had the usual scarring I associated with most inmates here. "Now I'm going to need you to stand up and put your hands behind your back," I said, keeping my hand near the holster where the pepper spray was. "Show me respect and I'll show you the same," I continued. "You won't have handcuffs on for long if you cooperate." "You're not better than me," Aluko said, his baritone voice fitting his size but sounding odd, like 4 or 5 people chanting in unison. "All right," I said. "Let's get you moved to where you need to go. The faster we do this, the better off we'll be." "Here," Aluko shouted. "Someone shouted in broad daylight when you were in a gang years ago." It took 10 years for the paranoia to go away, the fear of the cops coming to arrest me for a potential murder, before I became a low-grade one myself. To this day, I don't know if any innocent civilians got caught in the crossfire. We restrained his huge arms and placed metal bracelets on his wrists. He laughed all the while. As we brought him to solitary, I thought of his words and how much they unsettled me. They were true, and that story from my past was one I had not told anyone. Near the end of the shift, Buckley went into one of the sniper towers and smoked a cigarette. Since my duties for the day were complete, I took the spiral staircase to the level where he stood. When I saw him, I was just a few inches away from where he stood. He didn't seem to mind or care about the footsteps behind him, focusing on the distant and low winter sun. "The caged animal back there said something he shouldn't have," I said. "Part of the job is having thick skin," he said, flicking his cigarette over the edge of the tower. He turned around to face me. "It's not about that." "Oh, did he hurt your poor little feelings?" He had insight into my past that no one has, I said, bitterness filling my mouth. "Well, that's unfortunate. It means you lied to the oral board when you got into the position you're in now. You shouldn't lie to your employers." "I need to know what kind of prison this is," I said, feeling blood rush to my head. "Why does everybody have open sores all over their body and face? Are they exposed to some kind of virus? And if so, are we susceptible? Either that or they're always high on something. That would explain why they always speak gibberish. And how do they know things I haven't even told my closest people?" "You're better off doing the job assigned and not worrying about things above your pay grade," Buckley said, pulling out another pack of cigarettes and lighting one. "I hope we're not exposed to dangers we weren't warned about. I'll have to find a way to get the word out. If you break your non-disclosure agreement, it would be far worse than termination. Your life back home, the one with the dark, curly hair and nice curves. I would hate to see the impact of your decisions on her." That's when I grabbed him by the lapels and shoved him to the ground. I considered throwing elbows, the idea of making him taste his own blood satisfying, but I didn't want to be incarcerated in this place of misery. Buckley started laughing. What he did next took me by complete surprise. He patted me on the back with his free hand instead of trying to defend himself or resist. "You've proven your point," he said, pushing on my chest. "Now get off me. I don't want to give the signal to one of my buddies in the next tower here. He has a modified Remington 700 pointed at you." I released him. After he stood and brushed off some frost, he made eye contact with me. "I respect you for your bravery. Most people wouldn't be willing to do that to me, especially someone beneath me in rank. I'll tell you what. I'll shed a little light on what kind of place this is for you. And if I ever find out you told anyone, you'll wish you had died at birth." I felt the adrenaline start to wear off as my energy lowered. I nodded, giving tacit agreement to his new offer. I looked to my left and saw the sniper he referred to. It occurred to me that if Buckley had wanted to take action against me, he could have had me executed right then and there. Buckley waved for me to follow him as we made our way down the steps. He escorted me through the yard. Ice encased the weights and pull-up bars. We followed the chain-link fence to another facility where Buckley had coded key access. After he entered the correct digits, he swung the door open, and we walked down a hallway that didn't seem modern. There were lit torches on the walls, and the flooring was pallid cobblestone. Buckley led me into a large room, the size of an auditorium. A man wearing all black clothing with a white collar stood up, and it took me a moment to recognize him as a priest. I saw rows of long tables fit for a king in an ancient era, crucifixes, rosaries, chalices of water and stacks of dusty books lining every corner. I skimmed some of the titles and saw that a few were in a different language. "Father Lamora," Buckley said, staring at the man of the cloth. "What are you doing down here?" The priest pointed to his left. When I shifted my eyes in that direction, I immediately noticed the presence of a fourth person in the room, an inmate tied down on a slab. As soon as we focused our collective attention on him, the man came to life, struggling against his restraints. A red-tinged substance poured from his mouth like foam from a rabid dog. "I have almost driven the evil entity out," the priest said. Buckley turned to me. "What is going on here?" I asked, feeling an irresistible urge to run and scream in the other direction. But I knew I couldn't take my chances out in the harsh cold, though part of me was willing to at least try. This prison's budget comes from the Vatican. We only take inmates possessed by something greater than general sadism or psychopathy. In the official government paperwork, they call this place the House of the Demoniama. If you want to atone for the sins I know you're guilty of, now would be an excellent time to help us read the incantation needed to cleanse this heathen. More possessed inmates were flown in from around the world. The evening a young girl came to our gates via bus was an unusual occurrence. The transporting officers rolled her towards me on a gurney. She fought against her restraints, screaming in the dense, layered voice I had become used to by that point. She wore a tattered, old beige-colored dress, blood-stained in some places. I made a mental note to try and get her some blankets once she was in her new home. Her name was Anna. There were a few things that made her different from the others. For starters, her eyes were milky, and she retained the same faraway gaze they all had, but it was as though her pupils indicated narcotic use. Her eyes never got any clearer during my time monitoring her. One singular trait made her stand out from the others. She often quieted down on her yelling once she was in the presence of the staff. The inmates usually never cared who they were in front of unless it was to unearth our secrets or to shame us. She minded her manners, which was as alarming as it was respectful. Once I placed her in the cell, I knew I had to bind her to the bed after removing her from the gurney. As soon as I unbuckled one of the straps on her wrist, she reached up and tried to claw my face. I dodged her strike and reached for my belt, where a canister of holy water was instead of mace. I sprayed at her and smoke emanated from her skin as she let out a cry of anguish. I undid the rest of her straps and moved her to the bed, then shut the door and went to lunch. The lodging for the employees consisted of 3 separate rows of cabins. The most luxurious ones belonged to leadership. The second most comfortable apartments were for the priests, and the third, most decrepit ones provided shelter for the officers. Even though my space was hardly glamorous, it became my sanctuary. I could work out, read paperback books, and journal. These activities helped me maintain my mental sanity. I stared at the ceiling, thinking about how unsettled I was about the girl. Every inmate had a glimmer of humanity, and something about her made me want to investigate her past. There was only one computer in the entire facility, containing the reports and database, and it was in the warden's office. Rumor had it that he had access to the inmates' rap sheets, and Buckley had verified this for me in one of our prior conversations, though it was an accident. I waited until after hours to enter Buckley's space. I managed to bribe one of the janitors with extra snacks. Never underestimate the power of common items in a penitentiary. Buckley had left his computer on without signing out. Navigating the digital database of various inmates' profiles was tricky, but I decided to focus on the young girl. I searched for every Anna until I found the one I was looking for. A few things stood out to me right away. The main body of text on her infractions had many redactions. I printed it out, grabbed the papers, closed the door behind me, and headed down the hallway back to my lodging. I read the document on my walk. Even though she was only 20 years old, she was also a nuisance to society. She had burned down a halfway house she was staying at. She was there for many DUIs. Several judges had given her breaks, so they decided to put her in mental health facilities instead of jail. She kept attacking the staff there, and the worst incident was when she stabbed a nurse in the jugular. The RN survived but had to talk through a voice box for the rest of her life. Just then, I heard a familiar voice outside my door. "You're out late, officer," Nuso said. I turned around and saw his large frame. In the 2 months I had been there, I got to know him well. He had come from the Arizona State Prison Complex, and we had swapped some of our stories. His tales of encounters with death row prisoners intrigued me. "What do you have there?" Nuso asked. "A guidebook on how to perform a successful exorcism," I lied. "I didn't think you liked working off duty." "We do what we have to." "How did you get it?" "They don't let us use the internet here." "I found it under the seat of a mobile unit," I said, not feeling good about falsifying information. "Oh, I see. I came here to ask if you have any extra coffee. I'm out and don't want to go all the way down to my locker in the morning if I can help it." "Yeah, no problem," I said, unlocking the door and inviting him in. I stuffed the papers under my mattress so he wouldn't be able to read them. I reached into my backpack and pulled out some instant packets. I gave them to him and saw him staring at my collection of books. At the far end was a Bible. His eyes locked on it. He grabbed the coffee packs and looked at me. "Do you believe what they're telling us?" he asked. "You mean about God and the devil? All these biblical villains taking control of people here? It seems far-fetched to me. There has to be something more going on. What if this is an asylum for those with undiagnosed mental illness, the kind researchers aren't advanced enough to understand yet? Have you ever thought of that?" I sat down. "I don't think science has the answer," I said. "The ones in here have preternatural abilities. It's like they can read our minds, or at least our past, no matter how secretive we are. I've never felt so powerless since I came here. All I know is that I can't pretend to understand everything, whether it's celestial or empirical. I cannot fathom the evil within these walls. To pretend otherwise is arrogance." Buckley Owusu, a priest, and I walked together to Anna's cell. We could hear her screaming from 300 feet away. The other prisoners' lamentations were drowned out by her wailing. We entered her cell and saw words written in blood on the walls. She stared at us with a smile. Her face seemed puffier than usual, emphasizing the wounds on it. The priest pulled out a rusted black crucifix and raised it in her direction as he approached. Her screams grew louder with each advancing step. He pulled out a small pocket Bible and read a prayer. "Saint Michael the Archangel, defend us in battle. Be our protection against the wickedness and snares of the devil. May God rebuke him, we humbly pray. And do thou, O Prince of the heavenly host, by the power of God, thrust into Hades Satan and all evil spirits who wander through the world for the ruin of souls. Amen." Her eyes became less opaque, and I was able to make out their green color for the first time. She gazed at me and spoke intelligible words for the first time since her arrival. "Your mother died an early death because she found out you joined a gang," Anna said with a mocking laugh. I turned around to see if anyone was staring at me with judgment. The expressions were neutral until they turned into worry. Everyone in the room knew they would have to wait their turn for public humiliation. "You accepted a bribe to stay silent after an inmate stabbed another one to death," she said to an old guard. He muttered something under his breath, stating the inmate was a horrible person who mistreated children and commenting on how the earth was lighter without such a person weighing it down. Then Anna turned to Buckley. "You are the worst of everyone. Your wife died by drowning, and you received her life insurance policy. Wait until they look deeper into that." What I saw next horrified me. Buckley screamed, "No!" and lunged at her. His hands wrapped around her throat before one of her legs broke free from its binding and kicked him in the ribs. He must have forgotten to wear his vest that day because he folded and landed on the ground. The priest placed the crucifix on her forehead, leaving a permanent mark. She passed out, and her exhalation before losing consciousness made her body deflate into a natural thinness. Buckley called me into his office the next day. He asked me to take a seat with a menacing tone, slammed the door, and sat behind his desk. "Do you even want to work here anymore? I know this employment opportunity is very unique, but it's not for everyone. You knew when you became a corrections officer that this type of job requires more mental fortitude than most professions. This isn't any different because we're operating in uncharted territory." "Have I done something wrong?" I asked. "You entered my office after hours," he said, banging his fist on the table. "I don't know what your motivation was. Are you starting to believe what some of these inmates are saying about me? They don't see our sins with full impunity. They know enough about our interior lives and what bothers us enough to get under our skin. It is us versus them, and once you side with the enemy, you're no good to the team here, let alone me. If you're running some kind of vigilante investigation against me, two can play at that. Believe me when I say you don't want to be on my bad side." "If you're going to fire me," I said, "I won't make excuses. You should know that I wasn't trying to get you in trouble or dig up any dirt. I wanted to look up any and all information I could about Anna. She seemed to be more in control of what possessed her than the others. I wanted to figure out what made her so unique in that regard. I figured that if I ever wound up possessed, I could weaponize whatever she used." "You're like a child," he said as he stood and paced back and forth. "Do yourself a favor and stay within your pay grade. The Vatican has hired scientists to study behavior during possessions. In the old days, they would have dismissed it as different demons. You don't have a degree in microbiology any more than I do. We are muscle hired to make sure that demonologists are safe when they do their job, so you do yours." "Yes, sir." I felt as though I had backed down and given him some sort of sovereignty over me. I also knew that if I lied or resisted, it would only lead to a loss of money for my family and me. "And count yourself lucky," he said as he sat back down and picked up a pen. "I'm not reporting your mistake to any of my superiors. Do not make me regret giving you this break. Now get out of here before I change my mind." I made my way to the threshold. I faced him as I began to turn the knob. "One question," I said. "Most of the time, inmates come shipped here in groups. Anna arrived alone. Why was she given special treatment during her transport? Is she a celebrity? The daughter of a famous politician? It's within my rights to know as someone who has to check up on her." "Anna is my daughter," Buckley said as he scribbled on a pad and motioned for me to leave. As time went on, I saw humanity behind the violent demeanor of many inmates. A common fear among correctional officers is susceptibility to manipulation by the incarcerated. I tried not to become a victim of my empathy. One of the prisoners, named Aluko, managed to escape. I collected information on how he did it. Rumors said that he had turned a toothbrush into a weapon. He allegedly weakened the concrete around his barred window. Another tale claimed he overpowered a correction officer, who was too embarrassed to admit it and tried to cover it up. Aluko was a massive man. There was no shame in losing an unarmed combat match with him. The lack of weapons used baffled me. The strangest part of the story was not how he escaped. It became obvious they had some sort of intelligence. They were not as impulsive as we had judged them to be. They had the basic want of freedom, or the cruel entities that controlled them did. The most unsettling part of Aluko's escape was not how he managed to scale the barbed wire, nor was it his willingness to traverse the tundra. What perplexed me the most was how his life ended when he was left half a mile away from the prison. It was not just the evidence that something had torn him apart. The theory of it having been a polar bear spread, with jokes about how the bear wanted a meal to go with their Coke. One of the officers made a joke in the briefing room which I found lame, and so did the warden. Our general lack of civility was not uncommon, but some jokes were intolerable. While many wrote off his death as a polar bear attack, one aspect of the butchery did not align with that theory. Aluko's eyes were missing from his skull. A member of the search team said something had carved an upside-down cross into his chest, or what was left of it. Medics came back and told us everything they had seen. The brass took over the investigation shortly afterward. I asked one of the priests what could have ended his life and what kind of wraith-like being could perform such a precise and terrifying mutilation. "This has the makings of an attack by Azazel," the priest said. "That particular type of demon wanders the wilderness and can take many forms. Be on the lookout for anything resembling a goat. If you see horns when you're doing an outside perimeter check, be sure to recite a prayer and use this." He handed me a crucifix. Despite my stubborn agnosticism, I didn't want to accept it as a believable weapon, but I relented because he was so polite. Buckley called us into his office. When we got there, he didn't slam the door as I expected. Corrections. Officer Owusu and I gazed at each other with alarm as Buckley waved at us to follow him. He took us to an elevator in one of the back chambers that I had earlier dismissed as a room for the cleaning crew. The elevator was there. He opened it, had us step inside, and led us down to the basement. The subterranean chamber was completely barren except for two items. One was a stained glass window that depicted the Virgin Mary coated in ice. The second was an electric chair. I didn't know the prison had such a chamber. Everything about the scene looked old. It seemed to belong to a medieval era rather than having come from decades ago. The arms of the chair had the faces of gargoyles at the ends of them. "You might have been talking to officers about this," he said. "As a team, everybody is culpable except for me. The procedures we maintain of checking on the subjects every hour are important. It wasn't written as a flexible guideline. It exists for a reason. For an inmate to manage a successful escape attempt does not look good on us or the higher-ups in Rome. I don't know if you were lazy or scared to do your jobs, but either way, you need to toughen up and develop a work ethic. Otherwise, it's going to get ugly fast. Why the policy changed, regardless of our understanding, we now have to do 6 routine checks on the inmates every hour. If I hear a single complaint coming from your laps, you will regret it beyond measure. Are we clear?" After a silence ensued, Buckley called us incompetent once more and dismissed us. Owusu and I took the elevator up. I turned around and spoke to Buckley. "Warden, I have a question." "I did not permit you to ask one," he snapped. "I suppose after the beat down I gave you all, I'll allow it out of pity. Do any of the inmates have the demons driven out of them? And if so, where do they go afterward? Do they go back to the prison they came from? Are they granted immunity and allowed to go home? Do the exorcisms make them purer than what they were before?" "We are nothing more than pawns with a badge," he said with a sneer. "Don't ask questions if your wage doesn't merit it. How many times do I have to tell you?" I was wondering because I haven't seen Anna in a while. "Watch what you say and get out of my face. You are a hair's breadth away from me documenting your insubordination." Although I loved pushing his buttons, I didn't want the negative consequences. I left the room. I did not yearn to be the newest execution there. I went up into one of the towers and looked out at the expansive plains of frost and woodland. Buckley's threats and bullying were starting to get to me more than usual. Verbal abuse in my industry was not uncommon, but something about his irate tone under these conditions made it sting much worse. It filled me with a certain anger that I didn't know how to resolve. I figured getting some fresh air and doing a bit of investigating would help me stay preoccupied. I needed to clear my mind. Aluko's escape gave a negative impression of my work performance. I still refused to believe his death was some sort of natural phenomenon. I brought a sniper rifle with me and looked through the scope. Each bullet had a cross engraved on it. I tried to trace the exact path that Aluko took when he made his final attempt to escape. I carried a night vision device to help me see through the darkness. Half an hour later, I saw movement. It was subtle at first, with snow falling from tree branches. My heart raced as I saw a figure wandering through a thick cluster of pines. It was a woman in a nightgown, wet as the hills around her, with backward arching horns protruding from her forehead. The way she moved was peculiar. Her steps didn't seem to indicate any movement, as though she was floating. There were no indentations in the snow behind her. Her head tilted to the side, her face frozen in an expression of pain, as if she had suffered a paralytic neck injury. A black-tailed deer was only 20 feet from her. She sneaked behind it like a predator. What I saw next disturbed me. The deer's torso opened, spilling crimson spirit and puddles of red fluid onto the snow. The ethereal woman reached out and tried to grab some of the eviscerated body parts, but her hands sank through the chunks of meat. She wailed at that moment. I squeezed the trigger and connected. Her chest tore, splitting open. Her scream grew louder, and she exploded like an incandescent burst in the Arctic. She evaporated into ashes. The flames went away, and so did her spirit. A pile of black smoldering embers got carried away by the wind, decorating the trees like a macabre Christmas scene. The next night, I visited Ouso in his room. His place was a mess. He was usually clean and organized, but his few paperback books, sci-fi military adventures, were strewn about on the floor. I noticed he also had half a bottle of scotch on his nightstand, a definite violation since we weren't allowed to drink. The threat of an emergency forced us to maintain sobriety, but still, I wasn't going to snitch. "I think I killed a demon," I said as I took a seat across from him. "I searched high and low for the body and couldn't find it. One of the preachers told me it was a particular type of evil called Azazel." I looked at Ouso and saw his eyes seem to stare 1,000 yards toward the ceiling. "What's wrong, man?" I asked. "I found the death ledger," he said, "but I don't understand. Whoever flipped the switch on the electric chair we saw yesterday kept a logbook of everybody whose life he ended. There have been exactly 106 people killed in that chair. Some of them were repugnant before their possession. Others got locked up for a seatbelt violation. There's no consistency in regards to why they were worthy of capital punishment." Ouso pulled out a manila folder and tossed it my way. I flipped through it and saw many names, some striking me as familiar. "Do you suspect they were killing people under our noses?" "That's what I said," he replied. "I searched the papers for days. The serial nature of all the incidents of annihilation was clear. All were within the last year. There was a weird energy in the electric chair room," he added. "What you banished out in the woods may have been the spirit of a person already possessed and dead. It's possible that when they're killed, their demonic selves stay on this plane. They could choose to haunt us. Every ghost story written since the beginning of time could be the darker half of a human lingering. I must admit, I don't know who would want to stay in a place like this after all, though." I nodded, also beginning to wonder if he was correct or losing his sanity. "I helped Aluko escape," Ouso said as he turned to face me. "The conditions of this place haunt me. I want to assist many more." I had never seen a prisoner transported via helicopter until my 6th month of working at the facility. They landed on a helipad marked with yellow and blue paint. The pilot and guard took the detainee out of the chopper. They were both Army personnel, their uniforms indicating they were not low-level within the military. As I watched from one of the towers, I couldn't help but wonder who the new inmate was. The person struggled against the captors, but both were strong and kept them under control. I observed the subject's clothing during the escort down to the top floor of the cells. A black burlap sack was over the person's head, and a large blanket covered them. It was impossible for me to gauge even the basic silhouette of the individual. I had seen many kinds of transports, but none so high profile. It made me contemplate whether they were an insurgent from some faraway land or a kingpin of some nefarious domestic terror group. I asked one of the other officers if they knew anything about the person. They told me the subject was in the hallway to the most isolated cell on the grounds. Orders were not to take the burlap sack off the person's head. This perturbed me a great deal. I asked if we had any information on the person, already knowing that the answer would be vague if there were any concrete backstory at all. I met the warden in one of the break rooms as he was eating steak, better than the freeze-dried and pre-packaged artificial slop given to those of us lower in rank. I became jealous in a matter of seconds. "You told us to watch the prisoners more," I said as I folded my arms. "But what about the one in solitary? What makes them get more floors above the rest of the general population? Is this person the country's most prolific serial killer or something? What would merit such severe protections?" "I don't create the law here," he said with a mouthful. "Believe it or not, I'm kept in the dark about a lot of things as well. Don't assume because I'm not a grunt that I have all the details you crave. Do me a favor, when you get out of your next watch, take it up with the big guys in Italia, especially the one with the funny hat. I'm sure they would love to hear your thoughts. While you're there, tell them that I deserve a promotion." That same night, I went up to the top level and walked past the door that led to the solitary cell. Though I couldn't see inside because it was a wall of pure concrete, I did hear the wails of the prisoner. They sounded familiar. I was doing my routine checks when I passed one of the cells belonging to an inmate named Andre. He sat straight up and stared at me. I could tell something was different about him. He wasn't writhing on his cot, nor was he struggling with the usual muscle contractions. He walked up to me, and the barrier between us didn't give me a perfect feeling of protection. "I am cured," he said. The usual milky pupils most of the inmates had were now gone. "You are doing much better," I said. "I've never seen anybody look as clear-headed as you do now. Not around here anyways. How are you feeling?" "Paranoid," he replied. "Do you know what they do to people like me after they've driven the evil out of us? They send us to a mega-church in the Rockies. The church has its propaganda machine. They turn us into pamphlet writers or social media manipulators, missionaries for their so-called God. I would rather have Beelzebub as my host than be a door-to-door Bible salesman." "Who told you that?" "Your boss, Buckley. I wouldn't worry about that. He tends to say a lot of mean things to get a rise out of people. You don't understand. The transporting officers have told the other inmates the same thing. They can't all be in on one big lie like that. No offense, but none of you are that organized. I won't argue with you there. They say that once we're sent to their college compound, we must comply. If we refuse to work for the church, they put the demons back inside of us. They know how to weaponize those demons. It's not all about exorcising them anymore. If it ever was, it's about using them to control us." Andre's hand slipped through the metal food flap, holding a shank. The tip of the blade pierced through the midsection of my vest. I grabbed his wrist and wrestled the knife away from him until it clattered on the floor. I got a hold of the webbing of his hand and broke a few of his fingers, then yelled for backup. Another officer came by and sprayed holy water into the slot. When it did nothing, we switched over to pepper spray and sent him to the ground. Inmates using dirty tricks and distractions to try and get one over on me was nothing new, but that particular incident made me very spiteful and paranoid. When I patrolled the cells the next day, Andre was nowhere to be found. They had shipped him somewhere else. I wondered if it was to the nightmare place of forced worship that he had described. Owusu had lent me a copy of Milton's Paradise Lost. I felt obligated to return it to him. After I finished the last page, I went outside and knocked on Owusu's door. There was no answer. I went back to my room and grabbed a flashlight. I walked up to Owusu's door again and banged on it with another device. Even with the reverberation, Owusu still did not call out or come to the door. I had seen him fall into unhealthy habits, and he was worse for wear. His motivation to help people flee had gotten the best of him. His drinking had spiraled out of control due to the stress he was under. I kicked the door down. I couldn't tolerate the thought of letting him die by choking on his vomit after an intense bender. The room was empty and clean. None of his stuff was there. I walked into Buckley's office the next day. "One of the inmates smuggled a pistol in," I said. "Impossible," Buckley said, his eyes widening. "I need your help assessing the cells. There might be some ballistics evidence." "You believe that he used a gun?" "Yes," I said, and I escorted Buckley to the chamber. It was a mess, with items strewn about everywhere. "Where's the gun?" I braced my knuckles with a small baton and punched Buckley in the temple. He fell. I took his service weapon and master keys. I walked out of the hallway and shut the door immediately. I waited for him to recover. When he did, he shook his head like waking up from a deep sleep and gazed at me with pure hatred. "What do you think you're doing?" Lieutenant Buckley said, touching the side of his head for blood. "I want you to tell me what happened to my best friend. No lies this time. Where did Osu go?" "You talk too much. Nothing worse than the scrawny kid picked on in high school who gets into this profession. They always overcompensate. Sometimes it's better to not be proactive. Wait till you get out of the field. You'll learn that lesson the hard way if you live that long. I'll tell the boys you gave a direct order to leave this level alone. You'll be here until you starve and dehydrate. I don't want to be cruel, but you need to start answering my questions, or we're going to have problems. Who was the prisoner who came in cloaked the other day? Is it Owusu? Is he possessed?" Buckley glared at me and didn't answer. I stared down at the master keys. "Last chance to tell me," I continued. "I'm going to do my investigation if you don't help me." "Screw off. There's something I will say, though. Ever since Annie came here, they've changed some procedures. One on how those related to the officers get booked in here. Don't hate me. I don't make the rules." I wanted to ask him to elaborate, but was getting angrier by the second. I left him there and went to solitary confinement. I went to the most isolated holding chamber on the property. When I opened the door, I found a yellow hallway that ended in darkness. I turned on my flashlight and walked down the vestibule with a hand on my service weapon. I found the prisoner in the corner, their hands tied to the bed. The burlap sack was still over their face. I ripped it off. My wife stared back at me. Her face had cracked skin and was paler than I could ever remember. I stumbled backward at the sight of her. "No," I said through gritted teeth, as the dawn of my new reality cascaded over me. I punched the wall and broke a few knuckles too. I knew what I had to do. I undid the restraints on the bed and zip-tied her wrists together. I did not want the presence controlling her to fight me. "You never told me you were in a gang that used to rob innocent people," she said as I led her down the hallway. Her voice was not my wife's, but sounded like an actress mimicking her on television. I brought her to the first level and watched her pass the prison barn doors after I used the master keys to gain access to them. It was snowing when we went outside. "Where are you going?" I turned around and saw an officer I had met many times, Michael Patterson, who had the face of a bulldog. He never allowed anyone to think he was anything but a consummate professional. Humor was something he was incapable of. "The most powerful priest is out on sick leave," I said. "He's possessed himself. I have direct orders to take her to the city. I'm going to drive her to one of the churches there." "Did Buckley give you any paperwork authorizing this?" "It's in the prisoner transport vehicle over there," I said, pointing at the SUV 300 feet away. "Let me get her situated for the drive, and I'll be right back with that." Patterson nodded and gave tacit approval. Once we were in the car, I drove 60 miles per hour and far away from that wretched place. It took 2 weeks to get back to our home state. I returned to my house in the middle of the night so the neighbors wouldn't see my wife in the state she was in. The next morning, I restrained her to her bed. I went to the local church and managed to convince a priest to help me. I had to persuade Father Park that I was not a delusional person. When he arrived in our bedroom, he knew the case was legitimate. Park performed a lengthy 7-hour exorcism. Afterward, I walked him to the door. My wife had already become lucid again. She didn't have any memories of what led her to being in my workplace. "I have tried to pray and purify this house," Park said as I opened the front door. "If I were you, I would consider moving." As the priest walked to his car, I got his attention again by calling out his name. "Father," I said, "I've been meaning to ask, how do we protect ourselves from possession so I can ensure that this never happens again?" "Demons are like falsehoods," Park said. "No matter how intelligent you may be, you could fall victim to believing something not based on facts. We have to guard ourselves against lies and deception. In the same way, we have to always be ready when our senses tell us that something evil is afoot." I closed the door and went upstairs to embrace my wife. "How did the assignment go?" she asked. "Unchanging industries," I replied.